Now that I've covered the most fundamental effects that I use in mixing, I want to go back and revisit the drums to demonstrate how I work with the instrument as a whole. In the introductory video to the series, I showed how I import a MIDI file from Guitar Pro into 3 separate tracks so I can mix the kick and toms, the snare drum, and the cymbals separately using the same VST plugin, turning on and off the components that I want to mix for any given track. Today I'm going to break down my process for refining each track in order to obtain the perfect sound that I want out of my drum kit. I begin with drums because this is also my starting point for when I go to record a song. I want the drums to already sound pretty close to the final result because I record my guitars primarily over the drum track as opposed to a click track, which can be more precise but consequently robotic. When I play guitar, I respond to what I'm hearing, so I'll record differently if I'm going along with the actual drum track. I'm talking about subtle rhythmic alterations and accents that you can lose the feeling to when you're using a click track instead. By getting the drums to sound right initially, this ensures that I can get real-time feedback on how each section is going to play out as I record it. In doing this, I give myself one final opportunity to make last-minute compositional changes, usually reworking drum fills to create better transitions between riffs. The drum track is my songwriting foundation, and ultimately everything else is built on top of it, making the initial sound critical towards my final product. My end goal is to create a kit that still sounds natural, so no clicky bass drums or reverb-saturated snares. I've always been a fan of keeping things raw, and that term to me refers to a largely unadulterated sound. Of course, the paradox is the fact that I'm using a virtual kit and I have to do quite a bit of manipulation to achieve that, since the default plugin settings don't quite cut it for me. After all, these are designed for multi-purpose use and primarily more popular forms of music. They're certainly not optimized for extreme metal, and you're not going to get a good blast beat without putting some work into it. Before I get into the individual production choices I put into each track, let's just listen to some raw settings to get a feel for what I'm working with on my initial plugin and what I need to do to get where I want to go. Right off the bat, this track is not going to work out for me. The first thing I hear is a very weak and clicky bass drum. There's no body to it, so I'm definitely going to have to EQ boost the low end on that. The snare is too dry and it needs a touch of reverb as well. Of course, no evaluation can be complete without listening to the sound of the blast beat. So this is pretty much plagued by the same problem, but with one exception. I do like how tight and noticeable the kick drum is. So I'm going to need to EQ and reverb, but I have to make sure it doesn't cause the blast beats and double kicks to become too messy. There's always a balancing act that you need to keep in mind while you're working. What works for one section of your song may not carry on through the other sections of the song. Let's start by looking at the kick and toms track. I group these tracks together because I want them to have the same result, that big, booming low end. But before I start messing with EQ, I want to set the dynamic levels. High frequencies generally have an easier time cutting through the mix than low frequencies, hence why a lot of bands use clicky bass drums in the first place. My first step is to balance out these dynamics by dropping the volume of the high tom, boosting the low tom, and then super boosting the kick relative to the mid tom, as you can see from these virtual fader settings here. During my fills, I usually start with the high tom and I move towards the low end, so doing this creates a swelling effect in the volume towards the end of the fill, which builds stronger transitions. In the same window, I can also adjust the panning of each individual component of this plugin. Often people hard pan their toms to create a big sweeping effect during fills, but a real drum kit is a fairly centered instrument. Also, I want my low tom to be close to the center as well, because the intro of this song combines the kick and low tom, and I want a really strong focused sound in the middle. It would be kind of strange to have these panned too far apart. So what I've done here is I've pushed the mid and the low toms about 12 degrees off to either side, and then I shift the high tom an additional 26 degrees off towards the side of the mid tom, so that you do get kind of a sweeping effect during those fills. One important note about referencing: when you're mixing drums like this, you want to pick a section with slow individual notes, like quarter notes at a moderate tempo, so you can clearly distinguish each hit and how you're modifying the sound. You should primarily begin mixing here and then check your mix at a faster section like double kicks to make sure things still sound good when the notes are more clumped together. Then you can adjust your parameters to clean things up in the faster setting if needed. Let's move to EQ. My actual settings are already here, but I actually want to go through the steps of recreating this and give my justifications as to why I make certain choices. So let me copy this and then reset. I've already determined that I need to fill out the low end, especially during double kick and blast beat sections, to create contrast between the snares and even the guitars, which are pretty mid-heavy. To maintain a natural element, my initial step is to monitor the frequency spectrum of the track as it plays and accentuate those critical frequencies. So what we saw there were a couple of bass hits, and then the mid tom comes in and the high tom comes in. So the peak of the bass frequency is around 50 hertz. That high tom, or that mid tom, sorry, around 150, and the low tom somewhere around 100. So keeping these in mind, the first thing I want to do is boost the peak of that kick drum. I do this by putting a point at that 50 hertz peak and then subtracting out all the other frequencies. I like to also subtract those subaural frequencies, things below 20 hertz the human ear can't actually pick up. I don't know if it really makes a difference, I just kind of feel better doing it. Now I still want the toms to come in strong as well, so I will put the shoulder of this low boost at about 200 hertz to cover the peak of that mid tom, and I will also widen the shoulder towards that peak frequency. So I'll have this second point at 150 hertz and about the halfway decibel level between the peak and the floor. As I've showed before, I've already created a gradient in the volume level of the toms here with these faders. By doing the EQ this way, I've created a secondary gradient where again the kick tom is the strongest, the low tom is not as strong, and then the mid tom is not as strong, and the high tom is the weakest of the three. So let's give this a listen and see what we did. Now there's a problem. Because I've used subtractive EQ, this track is a lot more quiet, so I can't just turn the setting on and off and give a fair comparison. Let me boost this a little bit back up to compensate for the loss of volume. Remember before I had a fairly clicky sound that I didn't really like? It's also very dry and just generally weak with the EQ back on. I've already talked a lot about how I don't like clicky drums, but actually the click of the bass drum is a natural component of that instrument that can get drowned out with this kind of subtractive EQ. So I do need to add some of that back for the sake of realism, which I do by ear, and you can actually see the click in the frequency spectrum. It's right about there. So I want to boost that kind of 5,000, 3,000 to 5,000 hertz range. And get that click back. Now that I've set the EQ, I want to go and monitor what this sounds like, especially on a double kick, to make sure that nothing weird is going on. Now to me that's much improved. There's so much more body to this instrument track from that low end boost, and it just doesn't have that weak, thin sound that the original preset settings had, if we compare again. So if I go back and forth and compare this setting to my original setting, it's pretty similar. I guess I had a slightly wider shoulder on my actual EQ to encompass that high tom as well into the boost. But as far as the click part goes, it's pretty much the same frequency range. So I'm going to get rid of the new one and go back to the old one. Even though I say I set my drums up front, I'm sure that this final setting is not what I had initially when I started recording. The truth is, it was probably slightly different, and I pushed the EQ around a bit once I had the guitars and the rest of the song recorded. So there's a bit of reverse engineering going on when I'm doing this process, because I am looking retroactively at what, took me several months to come up with when I was mixing for the bridge. But this is ultimately what I settled on, and it's the sound that I personally favor in terms of kick drums and toms. Let's take a brief look at reverb. If I isolate this reverb effect and just listen to the wet signal, the effect is quite subtle. The room size is 86, which is a good level. The wet is -8 decibels, which is kind of low compared to the dry staying at 0. But the main reason this is so quiet is because I've filtered out most of the frequency range, which is critically important for this track. For the filter, I chose a range of 50 to 600 hertz to exclude most of the high end, especially the click of that drum, which is important to avoid in your reverb because of this. So as I increase that low pass, you can hear this high-end shrilly sound, almost like grasshoppers or crickets chirping. You definitely don't want to include any of this. It just makes your reverb sound terrible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go backwards again, and as I play this, determine the upper range of the low pass that excludes all this high-end noise that I do not want in my kick track. So at about 1000 hertz, I can't detect any more of that sound. I guess I wanted more of a deep boom, which is why I dropped mine as low as 600 hertz. But this is definitely something that you kind of play by ear. So let's just do another comparison. So the effect is very subtle, but you can notice when it's on and off. The reason I use a weak reverb is because I want a very clean and tight double kick sound, and the stronger your reverb is, the muddier the kicks will get. I still want a bit of reverb to accentuate the individual hits during slow sections, especially the intro, but because of the trade-off, I balance the volume of the reverb in favor of keeping the double kicks clean. The very last thing that I do is I normalize the volume to around -6 decibels. This is the baseline that I use for my gain staging, and all other instrument levels are balanced sonically by ear around this. So you can hear as the track plays through, you can see that the volume level hovers around this -5 decibel range, which is fine. Let's go to the snare. This is the only instrument on the track, so I can skip the dynamic stage and go straight to the EQ. I've already demonstrated quite a bit on the snare track in previous videos, and there's really nothing fancy I'm going for. All I really want is to get a specific sound, which is John Bottom's snare from the song Kashmir. The main thing you can see here is that I start to cut the low end at 150 hertz, which is consequently the same point that the kick and the toms were boosted. If I put these two tracks side by side, you'll see that there is an intersection between the EQ levels around this 150 hertz region. This is to keep the frequencies between the two tracks from clashing and kind of helps each instrument stand out separately from one another. On the snare, I also include a very wide mid boost to get the specific sound that I like. Bottom snare is pretty strong on the high end, so I include up to 2000 hertz, but on the low end, boosting down to 150 gives the snare an extra bit of strength that's not there. So let me play some of this track. You can see if I exclude EQing this peak down here, that the snare gets really thin. And when I bring it back down to about 150, it gets its body back. So on, off. The next effect in my chain is this compressor with an output limiter, most importantly. In my early testing phase, I found out that when I compared my volume levels to the kick drum, the snare was a bit too soft, and to match the levels where I wanted it to be, the track ended up clipping. Having this light compressor with a limiter here lets me get the gain stage to match at the -6 decibel level, while the apparent volume of the two tracks are balanced to where I like it. This probably wouldn't have been necessary if I gain staged my kick drum to a lower decibel, like -18, which I think is a more common standard, but this is what I'm used to working with, so the compressor was helpful, if only to avoid seeing red. It's a pretty light effect here, 1.5 ratio, which is fairly small, and the threshold is pretty high. This is one of those things I don't really have a good scientific explanation for why I put it in. It just seems to work. And my last video on reverb completely dissected the snare drum, so there's really not much use in going over that again. All I'm going to say is I do use a stronger reverb on my snare than my kick. The room size is 90, so it's a little higher than the 86, and I encompass a much larger range of frequencies so that there's more room in the reverb that's being reflected virtually. Again, you want to mix in a slow section and monitor in the fast one. So let's go back to the blast beats. The last track is the cymbals. Now, cymbals are kind of an afterthought for me. I don't put that much time into mixing them because I don't think they make that big of a difference. The main thing I like is for my crash to be loud, of course, and I want my hi-hats to be very soft. Again, with the gain staging, the crash almost matches the kick if I play this around -6 decibel level, while the hi-hats sit at a much lower volume level around -18 decibels. I do like contrast on the ride, so I don't reduce the volume of that much compared to the hi-hats. And then here in my EQ, you can see that I've completely squashed out all the low frequencies. I don't find that they're necessary at all on cymbals. And then one thing I've also done on the other end is I've pushed to reduce some of that really high-end white noise kind of sound. And that just kind of helps clean up this track a little bit, especially during these fast hi-hat sections. Now here's the good part, listening to everything all together. And I want to start on a section near the beginning. So in this opening section, the kick, snare, and cymbals almost take turns playing, where no one instrument is on top of the other. They're at similar dynamic levels, where the snare is slightly the loudest because it carries the accents. I also like the interplay between the subtle reverb on the kick and the hard reverb on the snare. It's another sense of contrast that would be lost if both just had the same level of reverb bleeding into each other. I want to pick a few other of my favorite drum sections. So let's go to here. Then we cross our fingers and go to a blast beat. So personally, I feel like I've achieved the goals that I set out to do. I've increased the low end significantly on the kicks so that you get a lot more power to them, whereas before they were very weak. And at the same time, I've added enough reverb to get rid of the dryness of that snare drum, but it's not overpowering and it doesn't sound too artificial or fake. And the main thing I've achieved here is a good balance where no individual section overshadows the others by too much. And of course, I can't skip that drum solo. One point that I really want to get across in this video is that all these settings and numbers that I've shown weren't just theoretical values I dreamed up before I started mixing. They're the end result of listening and adjusting one setting at a time to achieve the desired sound before, during, and after everything else was recorded. There's multiple stages of going back and forth, tweaking one setting here and there to slowly and progressively inch towards that perfect final setting. Let me show you backwards what it looks like to take away one of these EQ settings that I glossed over really quickly so you can hear the real impact when everything is played together. Actually, I want to do a double kick section and not a blast beat. This high end on the cymbals. So without cutting out the high end on these cymbals as I did, to me the hi-hats sound super overpowering. Which is strange because, again, I've already shown you that the gain stage is much lower. It's a whole 12 decibels lower than the kick and the snare. But the high frequencies are just so powerful that they just push through on top of everything else. You have to always temper these because they really kind of just make your track sound noisy. And to find these points in the EQ, it's just a matter of iteratively going back and forth and adjusting your settings and just really listening to the response that you're getting. There's an amount of mixing that can be done by eye and that can be done by knowledge, like balancing certain frequencies by number. But the most important thing is at the end of the day, you have to mix by ear. Music is something that you can't automate. You can't just punch in numbers and expect to get something that works every single time. Whenever you're doing something, the most important thing is to pay attention to how it sounds. It seems like a dumb thing, but if you're not constantly keeping this in mind, you can very easily lose track of what you're doing and push yourself in the wrong direction. One final thing that I want to note about programmed drums versus real ones. When you listen to songs recorded with real drums, you'll often notice on blast beats that the snare may completely vanish or the kick drum completely vanishes. And the reason for that is naturally it's more difficult to hit something hard and consistent while playing lightning fast. Virtual drums do not have this limitation. Every note is the same volume no matter what. In fact, the opposite almost happens. The snare hits in particular are so close during a blast that they kind of merge and become louder, so the snare overpowers your blast beats. And what you can see if you're paying really close attention is that I automate the volume level of the snare tracks during all my blast beats, and I drop them by 1 decibel just to counteract this effect and to make things a little bit more balanced. Without automation, the snare is way stronger than everything else. And that's my starting point with the drums, but we're certainly not done. All the pieces matter, and as I cover other instruments, I may end up talking more about how the drums continue to play a huge role in why I make certain decisions when I'm mixing.